So we have been going through the Apologetics course. I think all of you are regular attendees by this point, and so know the gist of it. But to kind of summarize quickly up to this point, the first week we looked at arguments for God's existence, as well as how to make a good argument, the basics of apologetics. Then last week we discussed the problem of evil, and we dove into why there's a danger in giving trite answers or belittling the problem, as well as an answer the problem of giving too academic an answer when an emotional answer is better suited. And that leads us into tonight's topic, which is the topic of divine hiddenness. And I'm going to prefix this session by saying that this is probably the problem of God's existence that I struggle with the most, in terms of I have gone through huge periods of my life feeling distant from God, feeling like that God is hidden from me. And of course, during those times, you often see the fruit of your growth in faith coming to fruition in that time. But we'll be unpacking what the problem of divine hiddenness is, the argument that the opposition will be making from that, and then we'll get into a bit of a discussion time nearing the end. Lord, I pray that as we dive into unpacking how you are a good God and a loving God, and you have provided us with sufficient evidence to believe in you, but you are also a transcendent God, a God unlike anything else in this universe, Lord. You are so far above and beyond anything we could ever imagine that sometimes grasping your love and your goodness can be difficult for us, Lord. So I pray as we unpack this topic tonight that we would do so with humble hearts. Lord, I pray that we would reflect on this deeply, and I pray that by the end of it we would come out knowing you better, Lord, so that we can more fully worship you. In Jesus' name, amen. So, I'm going to start out by reading a couple of quotes, two of them from the Psalms and one of them from C.S. Lewis. So Psalm 10 verse 1 says, "Why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?" Psalm 13 verses 1 to 2 says, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me?" Remember that these are the same psalms, or the psalmist is the same guy who wrote psalms celebrating God, psalms magnifying how if he goes down to the depths of the oceans, he finds God there. If he goes up to the top of the highest mountain, he finds God there. So this is the very same author. David is writing the two extremes of human experience of God's existence. C.S. Lewis, who is one of the most interesting theologians, I would say, coming at theology from a very interesting perspective as an author and a mythologist, someone who studied mythology, and then coming at Christianity from that perspective initially, then finding God. And this is something that he wrote nearing the end of his life. So this is after all of his greatest theological works, and he initially published this as a pseudonym because he thought it was a bit too dark to publish under his real name. And then obviously later he admitted that it was him who had published it. But this is from the book A Grief Observed. "Meanwhile, where's God? This is one of the most disquieting symptoms. When you are happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing him, so happy that you are tempted to feel his claims upon you as an interruption. If you remember yourself and turn to him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face, the sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside, and after that, silence. You may as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become. There are no lights in the windows. It might be an empty house. Was it ever inhabited? It seemed so once, and that seeming was as strong as this. What can this mean? Why is he so present, a commander in our time of prosperity, and so very absent a help in times of trouble. This is very clearly a deep pondering by someone who has experienced that closeness, experienced a very real relationship with God, and yet, in times of trouble, he feels like not only God is distant, but to the extent where he's willing to contemplate, was this house ever inhabited? Like, was God ever really there? And I do think this gives a little bit of testament to our own fickleness. We tend to not remember things very well. We imprint on ourselves far more strongly the negative emotions, the negative experiences. Like, I'm sure if you were to think back on the last week and I were to say to you, list the top 5 worst things that happened this week, most of you could probably rattle off a bunch. But if I said to you, what were the moments that brought you the most joy or the most peace? Unless something particularly stood out, you probably don't remember it. I think we tend to take for granted some of those positive experiences, and it's possibly because we have a kind of fairly high standard of comfort in our day-to-day lives. And so we take for granted the very apparent presence of God during times of good. And so when there are times where perhaps we've drifted from him, or perhaps he wants to teach us a lesson through him stepping back, like a parent who knows that if they step in as soon as their child faces trouble, their child will never learn to face trouble by themselves. But C.S. Lewis is grappling this with this at a very, very deep level. And so I think we need to be sensitive when we approach this topic. I do think there are some people who broach this from the outside as a topic that is something quite close to their heart. Some people do genuinely feel like they have sought God and have been abandoned by him. And often that's accompanied with a whole lot of religious baggage. They have church hurt. They have had experiences with Christians spurning them where an open arm or an open door would have been a far better response. Perhaps they were greeted by intellectual answers rather than emotional answers. And so this is a very, very real problem. And so I find that the problem of divine hiddenness is a parallel argument to the problem of evil. Some people would reduce the problem of divine hiddenness to the problem of evil. They would say, like, you can boil down to, well, God being distant is an evil thing, and therefore evil exists, therefore God does not exist. And they would kind of reduce the problem of divine hiddenness to that. But I think we can come up with a fairly emotionally separated answer to the problem of evil and say, well, logically it does not follow that just because there's evil, God does not exist. But I think the problem of divine hiddenness is one that we really need to grapple with. And a fair portion of what we'll be going through tonight is inspired by Dr. Gavin Ortlund. Absolutely love him. He's definitely currently my most consumed content creator on YouTube. Makes some brilliant, brilliant stuff. But he grapples with a lot of the philosophical questions. And he's also quite possibly one of the most steeped in church history individuals that I know. So, well, I don't know him personally, but that I know of, which is really cool. And so I'll be unpacking some of his arguments and paralleling them with some of the opposition's arguments against this. So to outline what the problem of divine hiddenness is, because obviously we can see that in our own lives, I'm sure if we've been walking with God for any amount of time, we've felt that God can be distant. But this argument takes it a couple of steps further. Basically it says, how can an all-loving and personal God allow non-resistant non-belief to exist? In a book written by J.L. Schellenberg called The Hiddenness Argument, and this is probably the book that most famously brought this argument to the forefront. It is obviously, as I've shown, something that Christians have known about for a very long time. It's been well adopted into both Christian and Hebrew practices, that there are times where God is very near and there are times where God feels distant. But in terms of it being an argument against God's existence, it was a far more modern advancement in philosophy where people like Schellenberg presented it as an argument against God's existence, or at least God's existence in an an all-loving and personal form. In fact, Schellenberg concludes his book saying, well, now that we've done away with the traditional view of God, we can start to unpack what theism could be. And he even allows for some leeway in terms of the personalness of God. He just argues that God can't be all-loving in his personalness, which is an interesting argument. And we'll hopefully dive into that in a sufficient depth. So a simple syllogism, to summarize this, is that if a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief would not occur. That's premise 1. Premise 2, non-resistant non-belief occurs. Therefore, a perfectly loving God does not exist. So these are logically sound syllogisms, but we need to unpack whether or not they constitute a valid argument, and we'll do that in a little bit. Again, to bring us back to the fact that this is not a new thing for Christians to struggle with. In the book of Job, Job finds himself in trials, and he consistently asks God, why? And God doesn't answer him with a detailed explanation of why Job is going through this. In fact, the reason that Job is going through all of this is presented as not relating to Job specifically at all. It's a conflict going on in the heavenly realms. God's response instead is, trust me. We see that similarly in the Psalms, and the very verse that Jesus quotes on the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me, is a call back to one of David's Psalms, where he writes that same thing in the first verse. And so I think this is also something we need to approach from a point of sensitivity, where we tend to divide this up into, well, this is an emotional thing. This is, you feel that God is distant, and therefore you are allowing your beliefs to be predicated on your feelings. But I think this is an argument that can cut both ways in terms of the different groups in terms of how they feel things. If we divide Christians up into those who are intellectually driven, and this is a fairly rough division, there are obviously people who fall more or less on either side, but the intellectually driven, who are those who feel the way they feel because of how they think. I would put myself in this category. I'll often think about something, and how I think about that thing will then determine what I feel about it. And on the other side, you have people who feel the way people who think the way they think because of how they feel. They're more emotionally driven. And so they might not know how to fully intellectually explain what's going on in their life, but they feel a whole lot of things, and that causes them to think a certain way. But I think both of these groups can be heavily impacted by this. I know I have felt at times like, well, I see other people around me having these emotional experiences of God's existence. It seems like God's presence is very real in their lives because they feel him. And I find myself not feeling as much. I find myself going through long periods of time where I don't feel any sort of divine contact. And so that from the intellectual side can provide an argument. Well, the atheist could say, well, perhaps that's because God doesn't actually exist. And the moments where you feel his presence are just you making something up. Perhaps the music stirs in a particular way, or perhaps there's a particularly emotional moment and you attribute that feeling to God. And on the flip side, those who are emotionally driven perhaps regularly experience these feelings of closeness. They have a devotion, and during that devotion they're brought to tears, or they go for a walk and they can't help but skip and dance with joy because they feel emotionally close to God. But the problem is when those emotions fade, and inevitably you do go through periods where those emotions aren't nearly as present, they can bring about a massive feeling of separation. So for both groups, this is something we need to be grappling with care. If I can now present the way that Schellenberg presents his argument, it's slightly more expansive. He says, if a perfectly loving God exists, then there exists a God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person. If there exists a God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person, then no finite person is ever non-resistantly in a state of non-belief. in relation to the proposition that God exists. If a perfectly loving God exists, then no finite person is ever non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. So this is basically saying God is always open to relationship with everyone. So then no one can be in a state where they aren't resistant to God, but they're not in relationship with him. Because God would reveal himself to those people in such a way that they would find him, they would be in relationship with him. Then point 4, some finite persons are or have been non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists. 5, deductively, from 3 and 4, says no perfectly loving God exists. And then if no perfectly loving God exists, then God does not exist. And then the final deductive conclusion from 5 and 6 is that God does not exist. And this is a fairly powerful argument. This is saying, well, if God exists and he is truly all-loving, then he wouldn't hide himself from those who aren't resisting him. And because there are people who aren't resisting him but aren't in relationship with him, therefore he is hiding himself and he therefore can't be all-loving, and we can't have a God that isn't all-loving, at least in this framework of traditional theism. And so we then have to conclude that the traditional Christian God does not exist. So I think it's a good idea for us to unpack what that non-resistant non-belief is. It's quite important here that we define our terms again, because you can find yourself in a conversation with someone who claims that this is a fairly common thing, but you can also be in a situation where people claim that this is a very rare thing, but it does sometimes exist. So non-resistant non-belief is the idea that there are people who are not resistant to God. They are fully open to the existence of God. They aren't in any way, shape, or form inhibiting themselves from relationship with God, but yet they don't find themselves in relationship with God. This could be in the form of someone who's actively seeking God, but not finding him, or someone who's just passively going along about their business and doesn't find themselves in relationship with God. Commonly, the groups that are pointed to are like young children. Young children aren't actively resisting God, but they don't appear to have a relationship with God per se. Or they might refer to, well, what about people who've never been in the presence of a Christian missionary, for example, so they've never come across the gospel, they're just going about their days not thinking about anything divine, and so they're not actively resisting it. It is important to note here that most people who use this phraseology would say that you have to be aware of God to resist him. But we're going to engage with that idea a little bit more further on. Before I do that, though, I'm going to challenge you guys. I've tried to give you some tips about arguing and arguing well in each of our sessions, and I'm going to carry on doing that with how to engage in good faith. Now, good faith doesn't actually pertain to your religious faith, but this is just you're engaging with someone else with the faith that both of you are going to continue engaging in a nice way. You're going to have a constructive conversation. Often, with topics that are deeper and more emotional, there's a strong desire to depart from good argumentation and lean more into emotional, kind of angry or annoyed or those sorts of emotions, driving your arguments from a more personal side rather than from an intellectual side. And so, simply put, it's presenting both your and the opposition's arguments fairly. We tend to do a really good job of explaining ourselves as well as we think we should be explained, but then framing the other person's argument poorly. Some criteria here: you should be honest, transparent, clearly state your position or the opposition's position. Don't deliberately hide information to make it harder to argue with you, or don't deliberately obscure facts in the other person's argument to make it easier to argue against them. Respect, like not interrupting. It's very easy for someone like me who's extremely loud to just talk over my opposition, and then they can't make any good points because I just get louder and louder and louder, and then I win the argument, right? My brother always says, if you raise your argument, you lose. If you raise your voice during an argument, you lose. And I think that's a fair way to see it. Openness, again, being open to the possibility that there's new evidence that you haven't considered, and being willing to challenge your position. Clarity, again, this ties into transparency and honesty, being clear, articulating clearly to the point, not filibustering. That's another thing where you can just go on and on and on and on and take forever to get to your point, and it doesn't allow the other person to respond. And then consistency. Concede if you've made an argument, because this is one of the most challenging things. You've made a comment that, upon reflection, wasn't a good comment. You don't believe it, or you didn't frame it right, and now you find yourself in a position where you're not willing to concede that you didn't frame your argument previously in a good way. In fact, you may have framed it in a way that dooms yourself in your argument, but you're not willing to shift your position. You're not willing to say, okay, if I can reframe my position because I did make some mistakes, even highlighting those mistakes, and now you clarify your position, and we often don't want to appear that we're contradicting ourselves, because that can come across as a sign of intellectual weakness. But you would much rather retract a statement that you've made previously in good faith than spend an entire argument arguing for something that you don't actually believe, especially if that thing is badly framed or illogical. And so I'm going to highlight 3 specific fallacies, they're argument practices that are considered bad. If you use this, it nullifies your position. And then I'm going to counterpart them with what you should be doing instead. The first is the straw man. So the straw man, imagine literally taking someone else's argument and making a man out of straw out of their argument. It's a caricature. It's presenting a weakened form of their argument and then attacking that, which usually results in the person going, no, 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 and then they re-explain themselves, and once again you just take, okay, yeah, I hear you, but this caricature of your argument is what I'm going to keep attacking. And that leads to no progress being made, because you are not willing to argue against their real argument, so they keep restating their real argument, and you keep arguing against something that they're not defending, and that's a straw man. The counterpart is a strong man. And I highly recommend the next time that you get into a discussion, try and present the other person's point of view in the strongest terms possible. Think about it as if you were going to defend their position and present their argument from their position. And I mentioned this, I think it was 2 weeks ago, but I highly recommend this in other forms of conflict as well. Before responding to someone, when they've made an argument, try and see if you can present their argument back to them in a way that they agree with. So if you've got a sibling or a significant other or one of your parents or whoever, and you find yourselves in a disagreement, and they complain to you, this is why I'm feeling whatever. See if you can present to them why they're feeling what they're feeling, in a way that they say, yes, that's exactly why I'm feeling what I'm feeling. And then you can absolutely decimate their argument, point out how they're being irrational. And no, don't do that. I think you'll actually find most of the time, if you can present back to them the reasons why they're feeling what they're feeling, along with an apology, you'll find that the issue goes away. Because they've been heard, and most of the time in conflict, the other person just wants to be heard. So that's, you're avoiding misrepresenting their argument, you're avoiding arguing against something that they don't believe, which ends up being pointless, and you're also enhancing your own ability to handle someone else's beliefs. It allows you to think from their perspective. Why do they hold the beliefs that they hold, and is it reasonable that they hold those beliefs? The second is an ad hominem attack. So ad hominem just means against the person, and it's basically that where instead of presenting arguments against the argument that the other person has presented, you attack the person themselves. So you might say, don't listen to Tim and his arguments for God's existence because Tim kicks puppies. Now, Tim kicking puppies has nothing to do with the validity of his argument that God exists. So that's an ad hominem attack. You're saying, well, you are the kind of person who does whatever, 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 and you're not actually addressing the issue at hand. And again, we can apply this to other forms of argumentation where statements such as "you always" come into conversation, and now both people are one person's on the offense and the other person's on the defense, and now you're arguing about a whole different set of issues that aren't actually focused on the issue that you were discussing previously. And so, for example, in the problem of divine hiddenness, the opposition could be claiming to be a non-resistant non-believer. So if you just start attacking their character, saying, but you do this, and you do this, and these are all the ways that you resist God, they're just going to get defensive about their character, and you're going to miss the whole conversation you could have had, showing that their argumentation is flawed. And so instead of attacking the person, try and untangle the person's arguments from the personal traits they may have tied in with it, and address the argument itself. And this is where asking people to explain themselves is a really good way to do that. With certain things, especially things that are tied, or people tend to tie to their own identities and then debate about, they've now tied this thing to their identity, and so if you attack the thing, they assume that you're attacking them. So this is where a special caution is required in asking them questions that lead them down a path to separating the argument from their own identity, so that you can say, well, let's depersonalize this and address the argument you're making without taking it as a personal attack. And then the final one, to throw some French at you, is called the tu quoque fallacy, which is also the you too fallacy. You also do this, or even you do that. And this is basically accusing the person of being a hypocrite. There is a distinguishing part of this that differentiates it from evaluating internal consistency. But an example of this is someone who claims to believe, for example, you also argument would be a smoker arguing that smoking is bad. And you say, but you smoke. Them smoking doesn't mean that smoking isn't bad. And so if they are saying that smoking is bad, you have to evaluate the claims that they make and based on the evidence they give, because them participating in something that is bad for them is a reasonable thing. They might be doing that. And so you can consider the fact that they might do this. It still doesn't make it right. And this is often with siblings. You hit me. Well, you hit me first. That doesn't mean either of you were right to hit each other. So that's a but you too fallacy, a tu quoque fallacy. Contrasting this with internal consistency, if you highlight internal inconsistency in someone's argument or their worldview, it means that they can't hold a specific belief based on the premises they've presented and still have a cohesive worldview. So for example, someone says, pineapple doesn't belong on pizza. And they present their premise, the reason is because sweet and savory don't go well together. Now, if you point out to them that they enjoy bacon pancakes, they can't have an internally consistent worldview that says sweet things don't go together, but bacon on pancakes does. So that's an internal inconsistency because they've stated a premise that doesn't match the rest of their worldview. So an alternative is similar to the ad hominem, where you just keep the argument focused on the arguments presented and don't get distracted by what the person themselves does. Again, this can be very difficult if the person themselves is claiming to be a non-resistant non-believer. You have to try and untangle their argument from them claiming that in order to address fairly whether non-resistant non-belief exists. Okay, so hopefully now we've gone through, yes.
So if this is about the second argument, we spoke about it being against the person themselves. With people who claim non-resistant non-belief, how do you distinguish what attacking the person themselves versus their actions? Because for example, I think a lot of the arguments aren't so much oh, I feel this way, I am this particular person, but rather I went to church my whole life, or I did this particular thing, I did that particular thing. And is there a distinction between looking at the person themselves versus actually pointing out inconsistency?
Yes. So I do think there is a time and a place. If someone is making their argument contingent on something like their own existence as a non-resistant non-believer, they are saying, I am the living proof of a non-resistant non-believer, you then have to examine their own claim to be a non-resistant non-believer. And I'll hopefully unpack a little bit on how to do that. But the best way to do that is to broaden that and try as much as possible to undermine the idea of a non-resistant non-believer without specifically saying, well, you specifically in these ways are clearly resistant to God. So that's where it you are arguing against non-resistant non-belief without saying you specifically as an individual do X, Y, Z, and that makes you resistant. And again, this is in terms of engaging on good faith terms. You want to assume that the other person is being sincere in the case they're presenting. And just now I'm going to unpack the fact that if someone claims that they themselves are a non-resistant non-believer and are not self-deceptive in that belief, they have to simultaneously claim that every single individual who claims to have had an actual experience with God are themselves self-deceived. So you do get to a point in the argument where if I am discussing with an individual who claims to be a non-resistant non-believer and claims that because they individually have done their best to try and interact with God and God has not reached out to them, therefore everyone else is interacting with a non-existent being, well, I can then say, well, I individually am not self-deceived and I have had personal interactions with the loving God, and now basically the argument from personal experience becomes invalid. And now you've separated. Now we have to argue in terms of the ideas and not our own personal experience, because if our personal experience contradicts, then my personal experience is unlikely to convince you and yours is unlikely to convince me. And this brings us to the expectation of personal experience. Something that we do have to consider is that if God is a personal God, then the greatest evidence for him would be through personal interactions. You wouldn't expect a God who can't be reached through prayer or any other personal interaction way to be discoverable via a microscope, for example, or any other scientific means. That would be a God that doesn't fit with his character in terms of how he interacts with us, which is why I would say that the way that God interacts with us primarily is on a personal level. And it's one of the really difficult reasons why it's very hard to intellectually argue someone into faith, because someone does have to have some level of openness to relationship to be able to have relationship with God. Okay, and so let's unpack the three implications of the problem of divine hiddenness. The first is they're assuming that there are non-resistant non-believers, or at least there exists at least one non-resistant non-believer. Two, the non-resistant non-believer would expect a personal God to provide them with an experience of his existence. And the third, and this is often not clearly stated, but they would expect the experience to be convincing. So it's not enough that you have an inkling of God's existence via some sort of experience, but they would say it needs to be convincing enough that they are convinced, right? And this is a really difficult thing to argue against, because I would say that all of us sitting here as believers have likely had an experience where we were convinced. Even if you were raised in a Christian household, there was probably a moment where your faith became real, and it may have been something that was like a feelings-based. You got to a point where you were like overwhelmed with a feeling of acknowledging your own sinfulness and your need for a savior, or something along those lines, experiencing the really pure love of God for real, for like what you might think of as the very first time you had a personal experience. And so often that is the moment, or if you've given your life to the Lord at another time, it's often again through some sort of experience. It's through, while I was going through a hard time and I reached this point, or I'd been having ongoing conversations with someone and I reached this point where God met me. That is usually the experience. So it is interesting when someone points to the fact that they would say, there are people who are actively seeking God, and God remains hidden from them. But this is important to note that often the opposition will dismiss all of those who claim to have experienced the Christian God, or any God for that matter. And they'll say, well, your personal experience doesn't count, but mine does. And you do need to now try and separate that out from the argument, because if you're just arguing personal experience, you're not going to make any advancement in the conversation. And this is the point that you can highlight to them, that they'll often present very emotionally detached arguments against Christianity in general. But when asked for what evidence they would find convincing, they would usually then point to some personal experience. So they might say, well, I would require that God write in the clouds every day, John 3:16. And if he did that for the next 2 months, and I saw it, I would believe. But if you asked, okay, well, what if you heard about a group of 1,500 people, or 20 people, that had happened to? Would you believe? Probably not. They wouldn't generally believe on someone else's attestation of miracles, which is quite interesting. And it is also interesting that most of the time the evidence they point to goes beyond just like a warm, fuzzy feeling. They want to see something truly miraculous for them to be convinced. So if they do highlight the fact that they themselves are a non-resistant non-believer, and that everyone else who has ever experienced any sort of religious experience is self-deceptive, you can then try and pose to them in an amicable way that maybe they aren't as non-resistant as they thought they were. So now you kind of have to unpack the idea of what it is to believe. If they truly, truly, truly believe that they are a non-resistant non-believer, then you have to now get into what belief is. And this is something that's been philosophically debated for as long as people have been able to believe things. And it's really hard to argue that we have no control over our beliefs. And I think that this would boil down to the whole thing of free will. If you have free will, you have the ability to make decisions to adopt beliefs. A lot of people would say, well, it's not my fault that I don't believe in God. Yes, I've heard arguments for his existence. Yes, I've read the Bible. Yes, I've done this, I've done that. I've gone to church my whole life. I've done this, I've done that. And they list a whole lot of things that they've done in order to try and experience God. And they would say, well, even though I find those arguments compelling, I just don't believe. And they'll argue it almost like they're victims of their own non-belief. Like, well, I don't know what I need to do to bring about that level of belief. But you do need to present to them the fact that if someone presents you with reasonable evidence, you do get to a point where you do just need to act in accordance with that thing in order to believe it. You have to just start believing it. For example, if I claimed that the light in my fridge is turned on by an elf and turned off again when I close the fridge. So I open the fridge and an elf turns it on. And when I close it, the elf turns it off. Obviously, this is absurd. And so you can then present to me a far more rational grounding of understanding of this. You can point out, like, look, there's the little switch. And I can say, yeah, that's the one that the elf presses. And I can show you how the door compresses it and all of that. But there comes to a point where I can't say, well, it's not my fault that I just don't believe in your fridge theory. I believe that an elf does it. They have to just start to align their beliefs with the rational presentation that you've given them. And again, someone who participates in an activity such as drunk driving, when presented with evidence that this can be incredibly harmful, both to you as an individual and to others, they can't just say, well, it's not my fault, I just don't believe that it's dangerous. We would say to them, well, there comes to a point in light of the evidence and sufficient lack of a counter to that evidence that you need to believe. You just need to. And we don't really think through what belief takes, because it does sometimes feel like we just start believing things and we don't really have control over that. But I think every time that we've changed our minds on something, we've been open to the possibility of being wrong, and we've then taken steps to adjust our behavior in line with the newfound belief. And so I think it's important to point out that just going through a bunch of motions, like going to church every week, especially if undertaken from the position of, well, I'm just going to do this to prove that I am open to Christianity, you're not actually open to Christianity. You're not actually open to God. You're open to the idea of disproving God by your own openness to God, if that makes sense. So, we've come through a whole presentation of what the non-resistant non-believer might present and how they might say, well, if God was a loving God and a personal God, he would seek out relationship with us. But I'm now going to present an idea of a God that has good reason for not meeting our every miraculous desire. When we want a miracle, God doesn't necessarily give us a miracle because that's not the way God works. We teach about a God who is partially veiled, a God who is knowable but is partially veiled. So there's a distinction there. He's not just veiled, he is knowable. And we would find the greatest evidence of this in Jesus Christ. Jesus was a tangible human being, just like us, but he was also God. And I love the story of a king who falls in love with a peasant girl, and he's wishing for her to love him back. But his advisors say, why don't you just compel her by royal decree to be your wife? But the king knows that that won't be a sincere love. She'll just be compelled to love him. I asked Vincent 2 weeks ago if I could give him a love potion that he could give to anyone and they would instantly fall in love with him completely for the rest of his life. Would he do it? He then said he would drink it himself. But funny answers aside, most people would rather not have someone who is chemically compelled by some magic potion to love them. Similarly, when this king was offered the possibility of lavishing all of his glory and wealth on her, he knew again that might not be a sincere love. That might simply be a love that's driven out of a desire to have more of the stuff. And we see this similarly with Jesus. When Jesus did miracles, a lot of people sought after Jesus for the miracles. They wanted to be fed, and they weren't seeking the bread of life, they were seeking whatever kind of bread he was feeding them. And I think similarly with this, we can find ourselves in an intellectual pursuit of the miraculous without being open to the possibility of the miracle giver in that. And so eventually the king decides that the right possibility, or the correct choice to make this peasant girl fall in love with him is that he must lay aside his splendor, lay aside his royalty, and become like her, adopting this persona of a peasant, and then in laying aside that, he can have this personal relationship where he's assured that it's a sincere love. She's loving him for him. And again, similarly with God, our relationship with God isn't simply a transactional, cool God, you proved that you exist, now I believe in you. God wants more than just our belief. He wants a loving relationship with us. So he doesn't really want a bunch of previously atheists who are now begrudgingly like, yep, well, I saw the writing in the sky. God showed he loved me, and so now I'm forced into this position of believing in him. God wants a sense of humble submission to him. God wants a sense of truly desiring to be in a loving relationship with him. He doesn't want a begrudging submission to empirical evidence. He wants relationship. So again, to recall Gavin Ortlund, his work on the topic, he gives 3 theses, and I've broken each of the 3 theses into 3 sub-points. The first is that we can't overemphasize divine love while underemphasizing other divine attributes such as divine transcendence. So divine transcendence just basically means that God is not like anything in nature. God is separate from nature. And if we think back to the argument of God's existence from him creating everything, we were looking for a God that was outside of time, space, and matter. And so God is outside of time, space, and matter, so he is he's different to anything else that we can have loving relationships with. So we need to be cautious to put human expectations of love on a God who is transcendent. So the problem of divine hiddenness assumes to know what an all-loving God would do. We cannot liken an all-loving God to any other loving being because there is no other being that is God. And so while we may have expectations of another human who loves us, and we can rationalize those, it is possible that a transcendent, all-powerful, all-loving God would have a different way of loving us and revealing himself to us that is better for us. Because again, that calls back to the whole thing of being compelled by empirical evidence. Like, I would go as far as to say, when Paul became Paul, and he was knocked off his donkey by a bright light, and Jesus said to him, "Saul, why do you persecute me?" I highly doubt most atheists would want that to be their conversion experience. That was a unique experience specifically for Paul because God had a very specific calling on his life and wanted to use his testimony as the previous was a Christian killer, now planting churches. But he very clearly had a very real, submissive understanding of his sinfulness and a desire to love God, and that's where his relationship went. But I think you would find most people don't fit into that category. They would begrudgingly believe in God but not love him. And then, given that historically this distance between God and man has been embraced by Christians wholeheartedly as part of who God is, it's presumptuous to assume that it points to God's non-existence. You have to reflect on, well, perhaps our modern, specifically Western intuitions about what an all-loving God would do are perhaps removed from what an all-loving God would really do, especially given that all of the previous historians throughout all of history have grappled with God's hiddenness, but the vast majority of them maintained faith in God in spite of his hiddenness. And so that brings us to the question of, well, were they all deceived? Or is there some way to square this circle? And so God can be both ever-present and all-loving while being transcendent and incalculable. We can't fully grasp him, and I think part of the problem is those who have this expectation of God want him to be fully graspable. They don't like the idea of divine mystery. They don't like the idea of God being a lover who potentially withholds himself in some ways, veils his intentions in some ways, until the person that is this apparent non-resistant non-believer comes to a point of submission to him, willing humbleness to him, and that then flows into a truly loving relationship rather than one compelled begrudgingly. Then, secondly, the problem of divine hiddenness overemphasizes non-resistant non-belief. You don't need a perfect knowledge of God to be resistant to God. I think this is something that this misses. Often, people who make this argument want to fully understand God so they can either fully accept or fully reject him. But here we would say that even when you subconsciously go against the moral code that God has written on all of us as our conscience, we know when we do wrong, and yet we sometimes choose consciously to do wrong. We know it's wrong, and so we can be in rebellion against God, even if we don't fully know God. And similarly to the examples of people who have never come across Christian missionaries, I would say, well, if they adopt the worship of the things around them, they clearly have an idea of God or godliness or divinity, but they very clearly resist the God who truly did create everything, who is transcendent, by worshiping the stuff that was made. It also focuses only on special revelation. It ignores general revelation, such as revelation through creation itself. I would say that general revelation, as Paul says in Romans 1 verse 20, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made, and so they are without excuse. So here we find that in very creation itself, when you look at the splendor of a sunset, or hear the crash of waves on a shore, or you look at the minute detail in a sand grain, or a blade of grass, or a snowflake, or any of those things, you can't help but be bewildered by that intricacy and the majesty of creation itself, that all points to God. And I truly do believe that we are going to be judged on what we know, and God is a completely just God. And so a knowledge of God that is revealed through creation is one that can be justly judged against. Now, whether or not there are some people who, through that general revelation, can come to God and find salvation in it, that's something that people have debated for all of Christian history. But you read stories about Muslims who start pursuing God in an open way, and they start having dreams about Jesus, and they end up becoming Christians before they've actually received any direct missional evangelism about Jesus' existence. There are stories about missionaries arriving at tribes who've never been reached by missionaries before, and they find this group have had religious experiences that make them far more receptive to this God that's being brought into their midst, because they're like, well, yes, this is what we believe about God. And so there's at least a possibility that maybe those people are the non-resistant non-believers who, as soon as they become non-resistant, God reveals himself, and they do give their lives to him. And so, again, to point out this overemphasis on non-resistant non-belief, 85% of respondents to a poll run by the Atheist Experience YouTube channel said that if God existed, they would still not worship him. That is very telling, because this is not saying if there was evidence that God exists. This is saying if definitively, empirically, God existed, would you worship him? And they answer, no. That sounds absurd, but if you've listened to any of Richard Dawkins' recent interviews, you see that he's moved from a position where he said, well, yes, there would be some level of evidence that would convince me. He's moved to a position where he says, I would consider it more likely to be a hallucination. If God were to write John 3:16 in the sky above me every day for 3 weeks, I would consider it a hallucination rather than believing in God. So there you clearly have someone who would claim to be driven by the empirical data. They would claim to be willing to go where the evidence leads, but they're so closed off against God's existence that they would deny him even if he did exist. I had a friend at university who I said to him, well, if God himself appeared before you, was like, I am God, worship me, would you do it? And he said, well, it depends. If God would allow me to carry on living my life exactly as I do, then yeah, sure, I'd worship him, whatever that meant. But if he required that I change who I am, I wouldn't. And so I think it's entirely plausible, especially if this opposition has any idea of what Christianity entails. They might say, yeah, of course, I'm open to God, and I'm definitely non-resistant. But if you said, okay, well, if I presented to you a reasonable case for God's existence, but you were required to depart, like repent from your ways of sin, would you? The likelihood is that non-resistance would decrease substantially. And then finally, and I think this is the most compelling of the arguments, is that it's plausible that a partially hidden and a partially revealed God is a good thing. It is the best way for a God to have revealed himself. In a similar way to how the king had to veil his glory, veil his majesty, and put aside his ability to compel relationship, and instead approach it from a personal level, God is interested in why we believe him, not just that we believe in him. If our reason that we believe in him is, well, because God empirically revealed himself to me in a way that I couldn't deny in whatsoever way, then that wouldn't require faith. Faith is important. So an overt, direct, undeniable revelation of God might not produce in us the virtue of faith, but rather breed complacency. It's the uncertainty that we go through that shows our faith in God. If the very first time I was faced with any uncertainty in my faith, I then said, well, God clearly doesn't exist, I didn't have faith in God. I was complacently believing my own intellect or whatever way that I'd come to the apparent belief in God, but as soon as that was challenged, I depart from that belief. It shows I didn't actually believe in God. I was trusting in my own intellect or whatever. And so the virtue of faith is produced through some level of hiddenness. In fact, faith is the evidence of the things unseen. So if God was a completely seen God, we wouldn't need faith. And so a veiled yet personal revelation of God better meets the need of our moral resistance without overcoming that need by compulsion. If you had moral resistance against God, if you didn't want to turn from your sin, but God revealed himself to you in a way that you were like, okay, I have to believe in you now, you probably wouldn't have the conviction, that the changing of heart that is required of us. And so again, I think it's this final thing, that a partially hidden and a partially revealed God is a good thing. That is the way that God has chosen to reveal himself to us. So in conclusion, although God's revelation is not so overpowering as to remove all ambiguity, it's adequate for the person who perseveres in sincere openness. If you seek, you will find. A conversion, simply by means of acknowledgement of a miracle, may not induce the humble repentance that God desires in order to have a relationship with us. And I think that is the entirety of the Christian understanding of God's hiddenness. The way that God can feel distant in times of need can be so that we grow in faith in him. Will we trust him in times, even when we don't feel those things? Do we have faith in our feelings, or do we have faith in God? So, we're going to move out of this time of me info dumping on you guys, and we're going to put some of this to practice. This is going to be a little bit different, because I'm not going to fully define what you guys must discuss. But I would like you guys to pair up, and we'll probably switch once during the discussion time. Pair up and have a conversation. One of you take the part of the opposition, one of you take the part of the Christian, and have an open dialogue, the way one might flow through any of the topics that we've touched on, and any interesting arguments that you might think of. So I'm not going to heavily restrict what you can and can't talk about, but choose who's going to be the opposition, who's going to be the Christian, and see if, in the next little while, you can have a productive conversation in which you both challenge each other. Because, well, if you just go out in the wild and go and find your nearest neighborhood atheist, and you're like, right, let's argue, you might not be very good at it at first. So one of the ways that we can sharpen our skills and improve our argumentation and become aware of other arguments is by practicing. And that's why I really want to encourage you guys to have difficult conversations with fellow Christians about less consequential things, and then build up to bigger things you might disagree with them about. See if you can have those conversations in a loving way. If not, you're not ready to go out and talk to atheists, because you're going to be a stumbling block to them. Because when they find you screaming at them about how much Jesus loves them, they're not going to feel very loved by Jesus in that moment. And as Gandhi said, I love your Christ, but I hate your Christians. That's often how atheists feel. Often the reason that atheists feel God is distant is because Christians are hostile. And so let's practice a little bit. Pair up, have a conversation. If you do need some guidance in terms of where to kick the conversation off, just put your hand up once you're in your pairs, and I'll come and give you some guidance. I'll pose some challenging questions. And we'll then probably shuffle the pairs. So choose wisely whether you want to be the opposition or the Christian in this conversation, and do try and challenge each other in it.